The Willow Springs River ran wild with spring fury, swollen beyond its banks and frothing white around the cottonwood roots that clawed at the racing current. 7-year-old Avilo urged his spotted pony closer to the water's edge, desperate to prove himself worthy of riding alongside Quanah's warriors. The boy's dark eyes fixed on a hawk circling overhead, and in that moment of distraction, his mount stumbled on the slick limestone. The splash echoed like a gunshot across the camp. Clara Whitmore jerked her head up from where she knelt by the cooking fire, her wrists still raw from the hemp rope that bound them. The white woman's calico dress, torn at the shoulder from 2 days of hard travel, caught the morning light as she watched the small body's surface face down in the churning current. Her breath caught. She'd seen enough drowning victims pulled from her father's mill wheel to recognize the limp way the boy's arms floated. Something stirred deep in Clara's chest as she looked at Ivilo's unconscious form. For just an instant, the child's profile reminded her of a story her father had told her about a Comanche woman who'd sheltered in their mill during a raid 2 winters past. He'd described her as having kind eyes and a crescent-shaped birthmark on her neck, visible when she'd pulled back her hair to drink from their well. Tarnation! She breathed her miller's daughter instincts, reading the water's deadly pull in an instant. The current was dragging him toward the rapids, where granite teeth waited to crush anything the river delivered. The Comanche warriors around the fire froze their weathered faces, turning toward their leader. Quanah stood tall in fringed buckskin, his black hair braided with hawk feathers, watching his adopted son disappear beneath the surface. For one heartbeat, the proud warrior's composure cracked, revealing the desperate love of a father watching his child die. Clara didn't wait for permission. She lunged to her feet and dove headlong into the icy torrent-bound hands and all. The shock of cold water drove the breath from her lungs, but her arms cut through the current with practiced strokes learned in childhood races along her father's mill race. Behind her, she heard Quanah's deep voice bark a sharp command before his own splash followed. The river fought her with savage fingers, trying to drag her downstream toward the rocks. Clara's lungs burned as she battled the undertow, her heavy skirts threatening to pull her under like anchors. The hemp rope around her wrists made swimming awkward, forcing her to use a modified stroke that ate precious seconds. There, a flash of buckskin and dark hair 20 feet ahead, spinning like driftwood in the foam. She reached Ivilo first, her bound hands clumsy, but determined as she flipped the boy onto his back. His lips were already blue water streaming from his mouth and nose. Clara wrapped one arm around his chest and pounded his back with her free hand, fighting to keep both their heads above the surface while the current tried to separate them. "Come on, little one," she gasped, river water burning her throat. "Fight it. Your father needs you to fight it." As she held the unconscious child, Clara felt that strange stirring again, stronger this time. Looking down at Avilo's peaceful face, she saw something that made her heart skip, a small birthmark on his neck shaped like a crescent moon. It was exactly as her father had described the Comanche woman who'd sought shelter in their mill. Quanah's powerful arms circled them both, his shoulder muscles straining against the current as he pulled them toward the shallows. The warrior's dark eyes met hers over the boy's limp form, and she saw something there she hadn't expected. Not the cold fury of a captor, but raw terror barely held in check. Halona, the elder Comanche woman who had tended Clara's rope burns the night before, waded in, waist deep. Her weathered hands cupped Ivilo's chin, tilting his head to help the water drain while she spoke urgent words in her native tongue. As she worked, Clara noticed something tucked into Halona's medicine bundle, a scrap of familiar burlap that made her pulse quicken with recognition. They stood together in the shallows, and the 3 adults forming a protective circle around the child. Behind them on the bank, warriors and horses moved like shadows, but Clara's world had narrowed to the weight of the boy in her arms and the steady presence of the man whose body shielded them from the worst of the flow. Ivilo coughed a harsh, wonderful sound, and river water spilled from his lips. His small fist closed around Clara's torn sleeve as he began to cry the wails of a frightened child who had touched death and found his way back. Clara felt tears of relief mixed with the river water on her cheeks as she pressed the boy closer. Clara's legs gave out, then the cold and exhaustion hitting her all at once. She sank to her knees in the rocky shallows, still cradling Ivilo against her chest. The rope around her wrists had tightened in the water, cutting deeper into her already raw flesh. Quana's gaze shifted from the boy to her face, his expression unreadable. Water streamed from his long black hair, and she could see the rapid pulse beating in his throat. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the space of a hand's breadth. "Why?" The word came out rougher than Quana intended his English, careful but clear. Clara met his gaze without flinching, because he's just a child. The answer came from somewhere deeper than thought, from the part of her that remembered her father's stories about helping strangers, no matter their color. Something flickered in the warrior's dark gaze, surprise perhaps, or the beginning of a question he wasn't ready to ask. He lifted Ivilo from her arms with infinite gentleness, cradling the boy against his broad chest, while murmuring soft words that needed no translation. As they waded toward shore, Clara stumbled on the uneven stones. Quana's free hand shot out to steady her, his fingers wrapping around her upper arm with careful strength. When their skin touched, Clara felt a jolt of recognition so strong it made her gasp. She'd felt this same sense of rightness when her father had spoken of the Comanche woman's quiet dignity and courage. Behind them, the river continued its relentless song, carrying away the morning's terror and leaving something new in its wake, a debt that couldn't be measured in rope or captivity, and the first fragile thread of understanding between two people who had every reason to remain enemies. Later, as they huddled around the flames, waiting for warmth to return to their bones, Clara found herself studying Helona more closely. The elder woman moved with purpose as she tended to Ivilo, but Clara caught her glancing repeatedly at a small bundle wrapped in soft doeskin. When their eyes met, Helona's weathered face held an expression Clara couldn't quite read, as if the old woman knew something important, but wasn't ready to share it. "Long time ago," Helona said suddenly in careful English, her voice pitched low, so only Clara could hear. "Comanche woman helped by white man with kind heart. She give him something precious before soldiers come. Very sad story, but also story of hope." Clara's pulse quickened. What did she give him? But Helona had already turned away. Her attention focused on preparing herbs for Ivilo's recovery. Clara wanted to press for more details, but something in the elder woman's manner warned her that patience would serve better than persistence. 2 days earlier, the raid had come at dawn like thunder splitting a clear sky. Clara had been grinding corn in her father's mill when the earth trembled beneath pounding hooves. Through the open doorway, she watched the lonesome trail stagecoach lurch to a halt at Henderson's trading post, the horses wild-eyed and lathered from a desperate run. The Comanche warriors struck with practiced precision, their painted ponies wheeling around the scattered buildings like dancers following ancient steps. These were members of Quana's Quahati band, still free-roaming in the aftermath of the Medicine Lodge treaty failures, conducting their own war against the settlers who'd driven them from ancestral hunting grounds. Clara pressed herself against the massive mill wheel, counting riders 708. Their war paint was fresh, stark geometric patterns that transformed human faces into something both beautiful and terrifying. Their leader commanded attention without effort, his war paint more elaborate than the others, eagle feathers dancing in his long black hair, as his mount pranced with barely controlled energy. Even from her hiding place, Clara could see the intelligence in his dark eyes as he directed his warriors with subtle hand signals. She should have run to the root cellar like her father had taught her, Instead, she found herself studying how they moved, noting they took only what they needed, but left the stage driver's money pouch untouched. This wasn't random violence. It was business. The realization came too late. Strong hands dragged her from the mill before she could cry out. She found herself face to face with Quanah himself. Up close, she could see past the war paint to the man beneath, younger than she'd expected, with eyes that assessed her worn dress and calloused hands with professional interest. "You come," he said in careful English, his deep voice brooking no argument. "You live, others live. You fight." He didn't finish the threat, but his meaning was clear. Clara had learned hard lessons in her 20 years on the frontier. She went quietly, but her mind was already working. The rope was hemp well made but not new. The warriors carried a mixture of traditional weapons and captured firearms. Most importantly, they handled her roughly, but without cruelty. She was valuable to them alive. Now she understood why. This wasn't about ransom money, it was about exchange. Quanah needed her as bait to draw out Greasy Pete McGurk, the river outlaw who controlled Rattlesnake Bar Ford 30 miles downstream. Pete held 2 Comanche girls captive, using them as leverage against the warriors. But Pete was more than just another outlaw. He was the architect of a system that stretched its tentacles into state politics and land speculation. Clara's connection to this web ran deeper than she'd initially understood. Pete had murdered her father 6 months ago, making it look like an accident while stealing their mill deed and water rights. He now needed her signature to make that theft legal under Texas law. The camp at Willow Springs stretched along a bend where ancient cottonwoods provided cover, and the water ran shallow enough for horses to cross. Clara counted 15 warriors, plus Halona and 3 other women. Not a large war party, just enough fighters to make Pete nervous without provoking the Texas Rangers or federal cavalry. In the hours after Ivelo's rescue, Clara began to see the careful calculations behind Quanah's actions. The boy wasn't his natural son, but an orphan from a raid 2 years past, adopted after Quanah's own wife and child had died in violence, that bore Pete McGurk's signature. "You could have let him drown," Clara said quietly as Halona checked her hands for frostbite. Quanah tossed her a tin cup filled with bitter coffee. "Could have," he agreed, his English more fluent than he usually revealed. Clara warmed Ivelo's hands first, then her own, noting how Quanah watched every movement. When she wrung out the boy's soaked shirt, the warrior draped his own dry coat over Ivelo's shoulders, leaving himself in just his vest despite the morning chill. When a cougar's scream echoed from the hills that night and the horses began to panic, Clara instinctively pulled Ivelo behind a fallen log as iron-shod hooves flew past their heads. When dawn brought rifle fire from the cottonwoods and one of Quanah's warriors took a bullet in the shoulder, Clara pressed Ivelo's face against her chest to shield him from the sight of blood. The attackers were Pete's men, probing defenses and sending a clear message. Quanah moved the camp closer to the river, where the banks provided better cover, and Clara noticed he lengthened her rope enough for her to move freely around the cooking area. Trust was too strong a word, but something had shifted. When their hands brushed while covering the sleeping boy with a buffalo robe that night, neither pulled away immediately. Clara found herself remembering the warmth of Quanah's palm long after he'd moved away to check the sentries. During their quiet moments by the fire, Halona would sometimes share fragments of tribal stories. One evening, she spoke of a woman named Singing Bird who had been wounded during a raid on a wagon train. She hide in White Man's Mill? Halona said, her eyes distant with memory. Miller, very kind, try to help her even when guns sound close. She give him gift before dying, small piece of her dress blessed by medicine woman for protection. Clara's breath caught. What happened to the Miller? Bad men come. Miller tried to protect Singing Bird, but too many guns. Halona's weathered hands worked at her beadwork as she spoke. Singing Bird die, but first she pray her son find good heart like Miller show her. Her son. But Halona had already turned back to her work, leaving Clara with more questions than answers. The news arrived with Crow Feather, his horse lathered from a 30-mile ride through country that showed no mercy to the careless. The scout's face was grim as he spoke rapidly in Comanche, his gestures painting pictures of urgency and opportunity balanced on a knife's edge. Pete had moved the two Comanche girls from Rattlesnake Bar to Copper Gulch, the upstream mining camp, where bitter Sam Mackenzie held them in a shack. The location was strategic. Copper Gulch sat at the base of Pete's earthen dam, where spring runoff waited behind packed earth and timber. When Crow Feather finished his report, Quanah turned to Clara with calculating eyes. "Pete wants you delivered to Lucas in town, tomorrow at the telegraph office." "And you're thinking of accommodating him?" Clara's voice carried more challenge than a prisoner should risk. "I'm thinking of drawing him out to neutral ground," Quanah replied. "Willow Springs, where neither side has advantage." Clara shook her head. "Trade me away, and you'll never see those girls alive. Pete doesn't make deals, he makes graves." "Then what do you suggest?" The question surprised them both. Clara met his gaze steadily. "I suggest we make Pete think he's getting what he wants, while we take what we need. But that means trusting me with more than rope and tin cups." Quanah studied her for a long moment, then drew his knife not to threaten, but to cut the hemp binding her wrists. The rope fell away, leaving angry welts that Halona would tend later. "You run Ivilo loses his sisters," Quanah said quietly. "I lose my son's trust. You lose your chance for justice." Clara rubbed circulation back into her hands. "I'm not running. But I need to know how to defend myself and the boy when this goes wrong, and it will." That's how she found herself learning to load the Spencer carbine, their bodies aligned, as Quanah showed her proper technique. His hands guided hers on the lever action, teaching her to seat cartridges without jamming the mechanism. "Steady." He murmured, his breath warm against her ear as she aimed at a distant stump. "Feel the balance. Let the rifle settle before you squeeze." Clara was acutely aware of his chest pressed against her back and the solid strength of his arms bracketing hers. When she fired and the bullet splintered bark from the target, his quiet "good" sent unexpected warmth through her chest. The lesson ended when rifle fire cracked from the ridge above. Pete's scouts had found them again, attacking with systematic precision. "Get down!" Quanah's command was unnecessary. Clara was already dragging Ivilo behind the nearest teepee pole, the Spencer clutched in her hands. Through the smoke and chaos, she could see muzzle flashes like deadly fireflies. "Now!" Quanah's shout came from her left, and Clara understood. She rose just enough to see shapes moving among the boulders and squeezed the trigger. Her shot went wide, but it gave Quanah the distraction he needed to flank the scouts. 2 minutes of vicious gunfire ended with the attackers melting back into the hills, leaving behind a leather ledger dropped in their haste. Clara's hands shook as she reloaded, muscle memory already taking over despite her limited experience. When Quanah returned, his gaze found hers immediately. Something passed between them, acknowledgement of shared danger that went deeper than necessity. "Tomorrow we parley," he said. "Pete gets his chance to negotiate. We get ours to end this." Clara nodded, understanding their fates were now linked by more than circumstance. She stayed not because compulsion demanded it, but because Ivilo leaned against her side like she belonged there, and because Quanah no longer watched her like a flight risk. Noon's sun beat down on Willow Springs like a brass hammer, turning the dusty ground between opposing forces into a shimmering furnace. 50 paces of neutral earth separated the two groups, but tension stretched that distance taut as a bowstring. Clara stood slightly behind Quanah, the Spencer carbine resting against her shoulder. She tied her hair back with leather Helona had given her, and the calico dress hung loose on her frame after days of short rations. But her green eyes burned with steady fire. Quanah's warriors formed a loose semicircle, rifles ready, but not quite aimed. The Comanche leader sat his painted stallion with the bearing of a man who'd never backed down from a fight, his war lance planted beside him like a banner. Across the open ground, Deputy Lucas shifted nervously in his saddle sweat, staining his blue shirt despite the early hour. His badge caught sunlight in brief flashes that seemed to mock the authority it represented. 3 men flanked him, hired guns with hard faces and quick hands. Dr. Edwin Hartwell walked slowly between the groups, his medical bag in one hand and the other raised in peace. The gray-bearded physician had earned a reputation for neutrality that made him the natural choice for mediator. "Gentlemen," Edwin called out. "And lady," he added with a nod toward Clara. "We're here to discuss an exchange that serves everyone's interests. The only interest I see," Lucas replied, his voice high with nerves, "is getting that woman back to proper custody. Clara Whitmore is wanted for questioning in connection with her father's death and certain irregularities in land transfers." Clara's jaw tightened, but she held her tongue. This was Quanah's show. "The white woman stays with me until Comanche daughters come home," Quanah said simply. "No daughters, no trade." "Now, see here," Lucas blustered, but his words were cut off by a rifle crack from the abandoned trading post. Clara's head snapped up, reading the situation instantly. The shot was a signal Pete's men were moving to flank them. "It's a trap," she shouted, diving toward Ivilo as gunfire erupted from 3 directions. Quanah's stallion reared screaming as bullets whined through the space where Clara and Ivilo had been standing. The warrior threw himself sideways, dragging Dr. Edwin to the ground as lead slugs chewed furrows in the earth around them. Clara worked the Spencer's lever, chambering around as she scanned rooftops for targets. There, a glint of steel among wooden shingles. She squeezed the trigger, and splintering wood told her she'd found her mark. The rifle tumbled from nerveless fingers as its owner dove for cover. But return fire was immediate and savage. Bullets hammered the trough, sending geysers of water over Clara and Ivilo as the boy pressed against her side. She could feel him trembling, but his dark eyes stayed fixed on her face with absolute trust. "Stay low," she murmured, ejecting the spent cartridge. "Your father knows what he's doing." And he did. Quanah and 2 warriors were moving like shadows through scattered boulders, using terrain with instinctive skill. The Comanche fought with fluid grace that made their enemies' movements seem clumsy. Surprisingly, not all return fire came from Quanah's men. Walter Herman and 2 farmers had taken positions among rocks, their rifles cracking steadily as they targeted Pete's hired guns. These were men who'd suffered under the outlaws' extortion too long. The telegraph pole on Naarm. Clara called out spotting movement near the wooden structure. A man was working frantically with wire cutters, trying to sever their link to outside authority. Quanah heard her warning and shifted his aim. His rifle spoke once, and the saboteur pitched backward, clutching a shattered shoulder. The telegraph line remained intact, but Clara noticed Lucas's face had gone pale. The gunfight lasted 10 minutes, but felt like hours. When smoke cleared, 3 of Pete's men lay still, and 2 more nursed wounds. The Comanche had lost no one, though Crow Feather sported a bloody groove across his ribs. Clara found herself binding a similar wound on Quanah's left arm, using strips torn from her dress hem. As she worked, their faces came close enough that she could see gold flecks in his dark eyes. "You fought well," he said quietly. "I had good teachers," she replied, tying off the bandage with gentle fingers that lingered longer than necessary. "And good reasons to fight." Their eyes met and held for a moment, weighted with recognition that went beyond tactical partnership. Clara became acutely aware of her hands resting on his forearm, of how his pulse beat steady despite the violence they'd survived. Alliances had been forged in gunfire's crucible. Walter Herman approached Quanah with hat in hand, his German accent thick with emotion as he offered his services. Other farmers nodded agreement, men who'd lost too much to Pete's greed. As afternoon's shadows lengthened, Clara sat with Ivilo by the bullet-riddled trough, watching Quanah plan with his new allies. The boy's hand rested trustingly in hers, and she realized she no longer thought of herself as prisoner. When Quanah looked up from his war council and their eyes met, she saw her own determination reflected in his gaze. Tomorrow would bring fresh dangers, but they would face them together. The moon hung like silver in the star-drunk sky as Quanah led his strike force through Willow Creek's shallows. Clara waited behind him, skirts hiked up and tied to keep fabric from dragging in the current. The Spencer rode across her back, its weight now familiar. Ivilo stayed close to her left side, his moccasined feet silent on smooth stones. Two scouts brought up the rear faces, painted black to blend with shadows. Rattlesnake Bar lay 3 miles downstream, where Pete had built his ferry into a fortress, controlling river traffic for 50 miles. The outlaw charged crushing fees and had been known to lose boats carrying passengers he didn't approve of. "There," Quanah whispered, pointing ahead to where moonlight glinted off something stretched across the water. "Wire." Clara squinted and caught the thin line nearly invisible, except where starlight touched its surface. Pete's men had rigged a tripwire at knee height, designed to send night riders tumbling into rocks, where concealed riflemen could pick them off. "I see it," she breathed, moving toward the bank where wire was anchored to an iron stake. Her fingers found the twisted metal and began working it loose. The first rifle shot cracked like thunder in the confined channel. "Down." Quanah's command was unnecessary. Clara was already flattening against the muddy bank, one arm wrapped around Ivilo, as bullets whined overhead like angry hornets. Wires sang as lead slugs cut air above it, and Clara realized gunmen were firing blind, hoping to hit anything that moved. Muzzle flashes lit the opposite bank like deadly fireflies, revealing at least 4 shooters hidden among rocks. Quanah's body covered hers, and Ivilo's his chest pressed against her back as shots probed for them. She could feel his heart hammering against her shoulder blades, matching her own rapid pulse. "Can you reach it?" he asked urgently. Clara stretched her arm out, fingers scrabbling for the wire anchor while keeping her body pressed flat. Another volley sent water geysers erupting around them, and she felt Quanah flinch as a bullet creased his ribs. Still, he held position, shielding them with his own body. Her fingers closed on the wire and she yanked hard. The thin metal parted with a musical twang, and suddenly their path was clear. "Yo, mister." Quanah hauled her to her feet, and they splashed through the gap. Behind them, his scouts returned fire with bows' arrows, whispering through darkness to find targets among rocks. They reached cottonwood cover breathless and soaked, but alive. Clara realized she was gripping Avilo's hand so tightly the boy winced, and she forced herself to relax. "Sorry," she whispered, checking him for injuries in filtered moonlight. The boy's dark eyes were bright with excitement rather than fear. "You fight like Comanche, woman," he said solemnly, offering what he clearly considered the highest compliment. The mining camp at Copper Gulch was a collection of ramshackle buildings around played-out claims home to the desperate and dangerous. Most miners had moved on to richer strikes, leaving behind only diehards and men who preferred isolation to scrutiny. Clara crouched beside Quanah in brush above the main claim, studying the largest shack through pre-dawn gloom. Lamplight flickered behind oiled paper windows, casting dancing shadows that could hide anything. There, Quanah pointed to a smaller structure set apart from others. Bitter Sam keeps prisoners there. Clara's throat tightened, thinking of the two Comanche girls probably no older than Ivilo trapped in that windowless building. Beside the shack, she could make out a guard leaning against the wall rifle across his knees and whiskey bottle at his feet. "How many total?" she whispered. "Sam the guard, maybe 2 others awake. The rest worked night shift in deep tunnel." Quanah's voice carried grim satisfaction. "Pete thinks numbers make him safe. Tonight, he learns different." They moved like ghosts through scattered equipment and tailings piles, Clara's heart hammering as they approached the prison shack. The guard, a whip-thin man with nervous eyes, had dozed off, chin dropping toward his chest in alcoholic stupor. Clara reached the door first, fingers working at the heavy padlock while Quanah kept watch. The mechanism was crude but solid, designed more to keep people in than resist assault from outside. "Mary," she called softly through wooden planks. "Mary, can you hear me?" A voice answered from within, not Comanche but accented English, carrying desperate hope. "Hear, O Lord, someone's here." "Stand back from the door," Clara instructed, raising the Spencer's butt like a club. 2 sharp strikes, and the lock mechanism shattered the hasp, falling away to clatter on rocky ground. The door swung open to reveal 3 figures, huddled in darkness. A young Comanche girl of perhaps 12, her dark eyes huge, in a face too thin from inadequate food. And a young white woman Clara recognized as Mary Thornton, the schoolteacher who'd vanished from Millerville 6 weeks ago. "Where's the other girl?" Quanah asked urgently in English, then repeated the question in Comanche. The rescued girl answered rapidly, words tumbling over each other. Clara caught enough to understand the second captive was being held separately, probably in Bitter Sam's quarters as insurance. "We have to," Clara began, but her words were cut off as a shadow detached from the equipment shed nearby. Bitter Sam Mackenzie moved with twitchy grace of a man accustomed to violence. His knife blade gleamed as he lunged toward Clara's back, but Ivilo's sharp warning cry gave her just enough time to dodge. She pivoted, bringing the Spencer around in a vicious arc. The stock caught Sam in the knee with a crack like breaking kindling, and he went down hard with a strangled curse. Quanah was on him before he could recover, one hand over the man's mouth while the other positioned his war knife with surgical precision. For a moment, Clara thought she was about to witness execution. Instead, Quanah applied pressure to a nerve cluster behind Sam's ear, and the man went limp. "Alive is better," Quanah said quietly. "He talks we find the other girl faster." But their time had run out. Shouts echoed from the main camp as someone discovered the broken lock, and Clara could see lanterns bobbing through darkness as Pete's remaining men mobilized. The abandoned claim they'd chosen for temporary hideout lay in a box canyon 2 miles from Copper Gulch, protected by steep walls and a narrow entrance easily defended. Mary Thornton sat wrapped in blankets near their small fire, her face gaunt but determined as she shared intelligence gathered during captivity. "Pete's not just stealing water rights," she said, voice hoarse from weeks of rough treatment. "He's been forcing families off claims through violence, then having Deputy Lucas declare the land abandoned. The state authorities don't know half what he's doing. Telegraph reports are all filtered through Lucas." Clara absorbed this while cleaning the Spencer's action movements automatic after days of practice. Beside her, Quanah worked on his own rifle, occasionally glancing up to watch her technique. "Here," he said suddenly, setting aside his weapon to adjust her grip on the carbine stock. "Angle the butt plate this way. Fits your shoulder better." His hands covered hers as he demonstrated proper positioning, and Clara found herself acutely aware of calluses on his palms from years of handling weapons. When he moved to check sight alignment, their faces came close enough that she could see concentration in his dark eyes. "Better?" he asked, voice pitched low. "Much?" Clara managed, though she wasn't entirely sure they were still discussing rifles. The lesson continued as afternoon shadows lengthened. Quanah teaching finer points of marksmanship, while she shared knowledge of reading weather signs and water currents. It was practical information that kept people alive on the frontier. But Clara found herself treasuring these moments of quiet instruction. When Quanah asked, "You hurt?" after noticing her favoring her left wrist, concern in his voice caught her off guard. She'd twisted the joint during their escape, but the injury was minor. "Just a strain," she assured him. But he was already reaching for her hand to examine swelling. His touch was professional medical, but Clara felt heat spread up her arm from the contact. When their eyes met over her extended wrist, something passed between them that had nothing to do with medicine. "Keep it wrapped," Quanah said finally, his fingers lingering just a moment longer than necessary. Evening brought disturbing news from Walter Herman, who'd ridden out from Willow Springs to report on Pete's reaction. The outlaw had placed bounties on both Clara and Quanah's heads, enough gold to attract every gun for hire between Fort Worth and Santa Fe. Worse spring floods were building upstream, held back by the earthen dam Pete's men had constructed to divert water to mining sluices. The accumulated pressure was enormous. "He's got the whole river bottled up like a cork in a wine jug," Walter explained, weathered face creased with worry. "If that dam breaks, everything downstream gets washed away, including Willow Springs." Clara absorbed this with growing dread. Her father had taught her to read flood conditions, and she knew how much destruction a wall of water could cause in these narrow canyons. As night deepened and their small group settled into wary rest, Clara found herself sitting beside the dying fire with Quanah, while Avilo slept peacefully between them. The boy's presence seemed to anchor them both. "Tomorrow we end this," Quanah said quietly, eyes reflecting ember glow. Clara nodded, understanding their time for preparation was over. Whatever came next would test everything they'd learned about trust and survival in the harsh school of the frontier. When Quanah's hand settled briefly over hers on the boy's sleeping form, she didn't pull away. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to night sounds and the distant murmur of river that would soon carry them toward final reckoning with greasy Pete McGurk. The leather ledger felt heavy in Clara's hands, its pages stiff with dried sweat and oils of many fingers. Halona had retrieved it from the saddlebags of one of Pete's fallen scouts, and now the three of them, Clara, Quanah, and the elder woman, bent over it in lamplight. The first pages contained what Clara expected, crude tallies of water dues collected from desperate farmers' lists of ferry fees that grew more exorbitant with each entry, records of abandoned claims seized after their owners mysteriously disappeared. Pete McGurk's empire of extortion laid out in smudged ink and poor spelling. But it was the pages in Deputy Lucas's careful script that made Clara's blood turn to ice. Willow Springs deed, one entry read in Lucas's meticulous hand. Needs holder's mark Clara Whitmore. Payment to H. Harry for mill accident, complete body swept away as planned. The ledger slipped from Clara's numb fingers, but Quanah caught it before it could fall into the fire. His dark eyes scanned the incriminating words, while Clara felt the world shift beneath her. Hatchet Harry. Clara whispered the name bitter as poison. He He's the one who came to the mill that night. Said his horse had thrown a shoe and needed shelter. Her father had welcomed the stranger with frontier hospitality. John Whitmore had always said sharing food and shelter might mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness. And he'd lived by that code until the night it killed him. "You knew," Clara said suddenly, her green eyes fixed on Quanah's face. "You didn't take me for ransom. You took me to get this ledger." Quanah didn't deny it. "I needed proof that would stand in district court. Pete kills many people, but law protects him. This..." He tapped the damning entries. "This could hang him. And you needed me alive to testify." Clara continued, pieces falling into place. "My signature makes the deed transfer legal. Without it, Pete's theft is worthless paper." "Yes," Quanah said simply. Clara stared at him for a long moment, feeling something shift in her chest. She'd thought herself prisoner, then ally, then something approaching partner. But she'd been evidence all along, a living witness to be produced when the time was right. "You should have told me," she said finally. "Would you have trusted Comanche warriors seeking justice for a white woman's father?" Quanah's question carried no challenge, only weary honesty. "Or would you have seen Savage using pale captive for his own ends?" Clara considered this, remembering her own prejudices from just days ago. Would she have listened to a Comanche's explanation of legal intricacies? Would she have believed this painted warrior understood white man's law better than most white men? "Maybe not then," she admitted. "But I would trust you now with anything." Something flickered in Quanah's eyes, surprise perhaps, or gratitude. He reached across the space between them to touch her hand briefly. "The trade was never about ransom," he said quietly. "I would cut my own hand to return any child to their people. But I also needed Pete to believe he was getting what he wanted, legal proof that John Whitmore's daughter was dead." "Except I'm not dead," Clara said with grim satisfaction. "And now we have proof he murdered my father." Halona spoke up, then, her weathered voice carrying authority of age and wisdom. "The ledger shows white man's crimes against white woman, but it also shows white law protects white criminals. What makes you think papers will bring justice when bullets have not?" It was a fair question, and Clara found she didn't have a good answer. Pete had operated with virtual impunity for years, protected by his partnership with Lucas and frontier isolation. "Then we make our own justice," Quanah said quietly. "But first we save the children." The consequences rippled outward through evening. Dr. Edwin agreed to safeguard the ledger, his medical credentials lending weight to future testimony. Walter rode out to rally more farmers against Pete's dam, understanding now their enemy was more dangerous than realized. But as night settled over their hidden canyon, Clara found herself sitting beside Quanah as he sharpened his war knife. The steel sang against the whetstone, a sound that spoke of preparation for violence. "Tomorrow's parley is a trap," she said quietly, stating what they both knew. "Yes," Quanah agreed without looking up. "Pete cannot let us leave alive. Too much evidence, too many witnesses." Clara watched firelight play across his face, noting tension in his shoulders. Everything they'd built together, fragile trust, growing understanding. The sense they might actually win hung balanced on that blade's edge. But before she could speak her fears, Halona approached with something wrapped in soft doeskin. The elder woman's eyes held depths of sadness and hope as she extended the bundle. "Time has come for truth," Halona said softly. "This belonged to Singing Bird Ivilo's mother. She give to White Miller before dying, ask him protect her son if Great Spirit will it." Clara unwrapped the bundle with trembling fingers. Inside lay a beaded amulet worked in intricate patterns that seemed to shift like water, and beneath it a piece of cloth that made her gasp burlap from her father's mill, with a distinctive weave unmistakable. Her father had told her about giving the wounded woman a piece of grain sack to bind her wounds, but Clara had never imagined she'd see it again. "I don't understand," Clara whispered, though part of her was beginning to. Dr. Edwin had been listening, and now he stepped forward. "2 winters ago, I treated a dying Comanche woman shot by outlaws during a raid. She spoke some English, told me about a white miller who'd sheltered her during the attack." Clara's heart began to race. "She said the miller died protecting her." Edwin continued gently. "Shot by the same men who wounded her. Before she died, she asked someone to watch over her son if he could be found." The truth hit Clara like a physical blow. She looked at Avilo, sleeping peacefully between her and Quanah, seeing now what her heart had recognized from the first moment the child her father had died, trying to protect the son of the woman whose gift she now held. "That's why you saved him," Quanah said softly, understanding dawning in his voice. "Not because of my threats. Because your heart knew." Clara nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in her throat. Everything that had happened, the rescue, the alliance, the growing bond between them, had been built on foundations deeper than either had realized. "Your father and Singing Bird died for same reason," Halona said gently. "They choose love over fear, protection over safety. Now their children choose same path." Clara looked at Quanah, seeing her own wonder reflected in his eyes. What had begun as necessity had become something far more precious, a family forged by choice, rather than blood tested by fire and proven stronger than the prejudices that sought to divide them. Dawn came with the sound of thunder, not from clouds, but from hooves, as Pete's raiders swept down on the canyon camp. Clara jerked awake to Halona's urgent shaking, the elder woman's face tight with alarm. "Many horses," Halona hissed. "Too many." Clara rolled to her knees, reaching for the Spencer that lay beside her bedroll. Across the dying fire, Quanah was speaking rapidly to his scouts in Comanche, his painted face grim. The thunder grew louder, accompanied by wild yells of attacking men. Through the narrow canyon mouth, Clara could see dust rising like smoke against pale sky. "How did they—" Clara began, but Quanah's gesture cut her off. "Later," he said curtly, checking his rifle's action. "Now we fight." The first bullets began singing overhead, before Clara could fully process what was happening. She grabbed Avilo's arm, dragging the sleepy boy toward shelter as rifle fire erupted from multiple positions. Smoke pots rolled into camp, filling the air with choking gray clouds that burned eyes and made accurate shooting impossible. Through the haze, Clara could see muzzle flashes and shapes of mounted men weaving through boulders. Halona stood defiantly in camp's center, her beaded staff raised high as she chanted words in a language older than frontier wars. A bullet cracked past her head, close enough to lift her gray braids, but she didn't flinch. Then came the round that found its mark. The elder woman folded gracefully like a flower, closing at sunset, her staff clattering to stone. Clara started toward her, but iron grip on her wrist held her back. "She is with her ancestors now," Quanah said roughly. "Help the living." Through smoke and chaos, Clara saw Pete McGurk himself ride into camp, astride a big roan horse, his face split by a gold-toothed grin. The outlaw's clothes were fine tailored coat and polished boots that spoke of wealth built on suffering. Before anyone could stop him, Pete spurred his horse toward Avilo. The boy tried to run, but canyon walls offered no escape. Pete's arm swept down, hauling the child up across his saddle despite Avilo's desperate struggles. "Much obliged for the hospitality," Pete called out with mocking courtesy. "But I reckon we'll be taking our leave now." Clara raised the Spencer, trying to draw a bead, but Pete was already wheeling toward the canyon mouth. Ivelo's frightened face flashed past the boy's dark eyes, wide with terror, as he reached desperately toward Quanah. "My son." The words tore from Quanah's throat like a physical wound. He started to follow on foot, but Clara caught his arm. "He'll kill the boy if you charge," she said urgently. "Pete needs Ivelo alive for leverage." Quanah's face went through transformations, fury, desperation, finally cold calculation. When he looked at Clara, his eyes held depths of pain that made her chest ache. "He has my son," Quanah said quietly, the simple words carrying more weight than any dramatic declaration. Clara understood then what Ivelo truly meant to this proud man. Not just adopted orphan or symbol of generosity, but second chance at fatherhood after his own wife and child had been lost. The boy represented hope itself. "Trade me," Quanah continued. "Clara for Ivelo. He gets his legal signature, I get my son." "No," Clara said flatly. "Trade me and he kills both of us. Pete doesn't make deals, he makes graves." She could see desperate calculation in Quanah's face, the father warring with warrior. Every instinct told him to charge after Pete's men regardless of consequences. "He has my son," Quanah repeated as if the words might change her mind. The revelation hit Clara then with physical force. She'd known Ivelo was adopted, but hadn't understood the full depth of Quanah's attachment. This wasn't duty, it was love, pure and desperate and completely vulnerable. "I know," she said softly, reaching out to touch his face with gentle fingers. "And we'll get him back. But not by giving Pete what he wants." Around them, gunfire was dying as Pete's men completed their withdrawal. The camp lay in ruins, smoke still rising from scattered gear. Mary crouched beside Halona's still-formed tears, cutting tracks through dust on her cheeks. But their allies were gathering. Walter appeared at the canyon mouth with 2 farmers' rifles ready and faces grim. Dr. Edwin followed, medical bag in hand and precious ledger tucked in his coat. "Pete's heading for Copper Gulch," Walter reported breathlessly. Saw the dust cloud moving upstream. Clara's mind raced as she considered options. Copper Gulch lay at the base of Pete's dam, where accumulated floodwater waited like a loaded gun. If the outlaw was retreating to his strongest position, it meant he was preparing for final confrontation. "He'll use Ivelo as human shield," she said, voicing the fear they all shared. "Make us choose between the boy's life and stopping his crimes." Quanah's jaw tightened, but when he spoke, his voice carried authority of a war chief who'd made impossible decisions before. "Then we make sure he doesn't have that choice." As they prepared to leave the ruined camp, Clara found herself walking beside Quanah toward the horses. Morning sun was climbing higher, burning off smoke and revealing full extent of their losses. "Your shoulder," Clara said quietly, noticing fresh blood seeping through Quanah's shirt where a bullet had grazed him. He started to brush off her concern, but Clara was already reaching for him with hands that had learned the geography of his wounds. As she examined the injury, their bodies moved naturally close together. "It'll do," Quanah said finally, but his voice had roughened in a way that had nothing to do with pain. Clara looked up to find his dark eyes fixed on her face with intensity that made her breath catch. They were close enough that she could see gold flecks in his irises, close enough to feel tension radiating from his frame. "We'll get him back," she whispered, her words carrying more than tactical assurance. Something shifted in Quanah's expression, recognition that her concern went beyond alliance. When he lifted one hand to touch her cheek briefly, Clara didn't pull away. I know, he said softly, because you will be there. The simple statement carried more weight than any elaborate declaration. Clara understood she'd become essential to his plans, not just as evidence, but as the person he trusted most in a world that had taken too much from him. They mounted their horses in silence, each lost in thoughts of what lay ahead. As they rode toward final confrontation, Clara caught herself watching Quanah's profile, memorizing the strong line of his jaw and the way sunlight caught in his black hair. If they survived the next few hours, everything would change. The crisis that had thrown them together would be over, leaving them to navigate whatever came next without clarity that immediate danger provided. But first they had to save Ivilo, and that meant riding straight into the trap, and Pete was undoubtedly preparing in the shadow of his deadly dam. Copper Gulch spread below them like a scar in the earth, its abandoned buildings clustered around the deep mining cut, where desperate men had once clawed copper from reluctant stone. The wooden trestle bridge spanning the gulch looked fragile, as kindling in morning light, its support beams dark with creosote and age. Clara lay flat beside Quanah on the ridge above, studying enemy positions through a gap in rocks. The Spencer carbine lay ready beside her, its familiar weight no longer comfort, but promise of violence soon to come. Pete's men had turned the bridge into a fortress, using overturned ore cars and stacked timber as breastworks. Rifle barrels glinted from every shadow, and Clara counted at least a dozen shooters commanding all approaches. "They're there," Quanah whispered, pointing to movement near the bridge's center. Deputy Lucas stood beside a wooden crate in the main shack, his nervous gestures visible even at distance. In a separate building, Clara could see the distinctive shape of dynamite sticks stored according to mining safety practices. "He's rigged charges in the mine shafts." Clara breathed, understanding the tactical situation immediately. "Pete's not planning to hold this position, he's planning to bring down the whole gulch on top of us." Below and to their left, Walter's farmers were moving into position among rocky outcrops. Their squirrel rifles wouldn't be much good at this range, but they could provide the suppressing fire. Quanah studied the trestle's understructure with calculating gaze. "We go under, like cats on canyon wall." Clara followed his gaze to the network of support beams and cross braces that held the bridge above the 60-foot drop. It would mean crawling along narrow wooden planks with nothing but empty air below, while Pete's riflemen tried to pick them off. "That's suicide," she said flatly. "Yes," Quanah agreed with grim satisfaction. "That is why they will not expect it." The first phase began with Walter's signal, a mirror flash that sent sunlight dancing across rocks. Immediately, farmers opened fire from 3 directions, their bullets hammering makeshift fortifications and forcing Pete's men to keep their heads down. Clara and Quanah used the distraction to reach the trestle's base, where massive wooden pylons disappeared into shadowy depths. The sound of gunfire echoed off canyon walls like thunder, providing cover for their climb onto the bridge's underside. The first few yards weren't too difficult. Main support beams were thick enough to crawl along, and cross braces provided handholds. But as they worked toward the center of the span, timbers grew narrower and the drop more terrifying. A bullet grooved the beam inches from Quanah's hand, sending splinters flying. Someone above had spotted them and was trying to angle shots through the planking. Clara pressed her body tight against timber, feeling her heart hammer against rough wood as more shots probed for them. That's when Quanah's ribs betrayed him. The wound from morning's fight had been bleeding steadily, weakening him more than he'd admitted. As he reached for the next handhold, his strength simply gave out. Clara watched in horror as his grip slipped and he began to fall toward rocks 60 feet below. Without thinking, she snaked her arm down and caught his gun belt just as his fingers lost their hold. The sudden jerk nearly pulled her off the beam as well. but she managed to hook her other arm around a cross brace and hold on. For a moment they hung suspended in space, Clara's slight frame supporting Quanah's full weight, while bullets whined around them. Her shoulder felt like it was being torn from its socket, and she could feel her grip beginning to slip. "Let go," Quanah gasped, looking up into her straining face. "Save yourself." "Never." Clara grunted through clenched teeth, using every ounce of strength she possessed to hold him. "We do this together or not at all." Somehow, she would never be sure how she managed to haul him back up onto the beam. They lay pressed together for a moment, both breathing hard before resuming their deadly crawl toward the center. The entrance to the mining adit gaped like a mouth in the canyon wall, its darkness promising shelter, but also concealing whatever traps Pete might have prepared. Clara and Quanah dropped from the trestle's framework to the narrow ledge that led to the tunnel, their boots scraping on loose shale. Inside, the mine oil lamps cast dancing shadows on rough-hewn walls. The air smelled of black powder and fear, and Clara could hear voices echoing from deeper in the tunnel system. They found Avalo in a natural chamber where miners had followed a promising vein, his small form bound near several kegs of black powder. In a connecting chamber, Clara could see wooden crates marked dynamite, stored safely away from the powder kegs according to proper mining practices. A slow-burning fuse snaked between the chambers toward both sets of explosives, its glowing tip eating steadily through braided cord. Clara's heart clenched as she saw the boy's condition. Ivilo had been beaten not severely, but enough to cow him into submission. Dried blood crusted his split lip, and his dark eyes were wide with terror no child should experience. "Well, well," a familiar voice drawled from the shadows. Deputy Lucas stepped into lamplight, his badge glinting mockingly, while a Colt revolver held steady in his hand. "Come to collect your Indian brat, have you?" "Let him go," Clara said quietly, the Spencer held ready at her hip. "Your quarrel is with me." Lucas laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "My quarrel is with anyone fool enough to stand between me and comfortable retirement. You sign that deed transfer, and maybe we can work something out. I know what you did to my father." Clara said, her voice carrying across the chamber like judgment. "I've seen the ledger, Lucas. Your handwriting, your payments to Hatchet Harry. You're going to hang for murder." The deputy's face went pale, and Clara saw his gun hand tremble. Fear made men stupid, and Lucas had plenty to be afraid of. "That ledger don't prove nothing." He blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Pete made me write those entries." "Tell that to a state judge," Quanah said softly, moving slightly to Lucas's left. The Comanche warrior's movements were economical predatory, like a cougar selecting the perfect moment to strike. Lucas's eyes darted between them, and Clara saw the exact moment when desperation overcame whatever judgment he had left. Instead of shooting, he lunged toward the burning fuse with his knife drawn. "If I can't have the money," he snarled, "nobody gets out of here alive." The blade slashed down toward the fuse, but Pete McGurk's rifle spoke from the tunnel entrance with cold finality. Lucas pitched forward, his knife clattering harmlessly on stone as he crumpled beside the powder kegs. "Much obliged, deputy," Pete said with casual cruelty, stepping over the dying man. "But I reckon your usefulness just ran out." Clara swung the Spencer toward this new threat, but Pete was already moving with practiced skill. His next shot sparked off the tunnel wall inches from her head, forcing her to dive behind a broken ore cart as Quanah melted into darkness. The fight that followed was brutal, and close quarters fought with knives and gun butts in spaces too confined for proper shooting. Clara cut Avilo's bonds while the two men grappled beyond her vision, then dragged the boy toward what she hoped was safety. She could hear them fighting, meaty sound of fists on flesh scrape of boots, seeking purchase, harsh breathing of men pushed beyond endurance. When Quanah's pained grunt echoed through the chamber, Clara abandoned caution and racked around into the Spencer's chamber. The muzzle flash lit the scene like lightning. Pete astride Quanah's chest, with hands wrapped around the warrior's throat, his face twisted with killing fury. Clara's shot took him high in the shoulder, spinning him away, but not dropping him. Pete scrambled for his fallen rifle, blood streaming down his arm, but Quanah was already rising with fluid grace. The two men faced each other across 6 feet of stone floor, both wounded, both determined to end this fight once and for all. Thunder rolled across the canyon. But this wasn't summer storms. This was the sound of Earth itself breaking apart as Pete's dam finally surrendered to impossible pressure. Walter's farmers had done their work well, using dynamite to blast strategic holes in the earthwork barrier. Now the accumulated floodwater of an entire spring's runoff was roaring down the canyon like nature's wrath given form. Pete heard it too, the growing thunder that meant his empire was literally washing away. With desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose, he grabbed deed papers from his coat and lunged toward Clara. "Sign it!" He screamed over the approaching roar, pressing his knife blade against Ivilo's throat as the boy clung to Clara's skirts. "Sign the deed, or watch the brat die." They were on the trestle bridge now, driven from the mine by rising water in the gulch below. The wooden structure groaned and swayed under their feet as the flood surge approached, and Clara could see the bridge's support pylons beginning to shift in their foundations. But before Pete could force her hand, the first wave hit with the power of a freight train made of water and debris. The bridge bucked like a living thing in agony timber, screaming as nails and joints fought against forces they were never designed to withstand. Clara found herself holding Ivilo while standing on a section of decking that tilted at increasingly dangerous angles. Massive tree trunks swept past like battering rams, some striking the bridge supports with impacts that sent tremors through the entire structure. Pete made one last desperate grab for the papers as they fluttered in the wind, but lost his footing as another section of bridge peeled away. Clara watched him tumble into the brown torrent below, his screams lost in the thunder as the river claimed its debt. But they weren't safe yet. The bridge was disintegrating around them in stages, planks and timbers peeling away as the flood tore at its foundations. Clara and Ivilo found themselves on an increasingly isolated section that swayed sickeningly with each new impact from debris. That's when Quanah made his choice. Moving with decisive speed despite his injuries, he wrapped his riata around his own waist and then around Clara and Ivilo, binding all three together with 40 feet of braided rawhide. His shoulder, already damaged from morning's fight, dislocated completely as he took their combined weight on the rope. But he braced his good arm against a support beam and used the leverage to maintain his grip. The remaining bridge section collapsed beneath them with a grinding crash, but Quanah's preparation saved them. Using the beam as a fulcrum and his belt as additional support, he managed to control their descent as they swung toward the canyon wall, where Walter and Dr. Edwin waited with additional ropes. Hands reached down from the rim to drag them to safety as the last of the bridge disappeared in a maelstrom of muddy water and splintered wood. Clara found herself sitting in blessed stillness beside Quanah, while Edwin worked to reset his dislocated shoulder, the joint popping back into place with an audible sound that made everyone wince. Ivilo was pressed between them, safe, despite everything they'd endured. The ledger had survived in Edwin's medical bag, its pages still intact and damning. Lucas's final confession, recorded in the doctor's precise handwriting as the deputy died, would stand as legal testimony. Most importantly, the children were free, all of them. Justice, Clara realized, sometimes came not from courts and judges, but from the simple act of good people refusing to surrender to evil. The river had washed away Pete McGurk and his crimes, but it had also carried them to something better than mere survival. The rain came softly at first, barely more than mist rising from sun-warmed stones of Willow Springs. By afternoon, it had settled into a steady drizzle that washed dust and gunpowder from the faces of the living and gave the world the clean, sharp smell of new beginnings. Clara knelt beside Halona's burial scaffold, adding her own small offering to the collection of beadwork and medicine bundles placed there by grieving friends. The elevated platform stood on the hill overlooking the river, where the elder woman had spent her final mourning. Mary Thornton had brought the two rescued Comanche girls to pay their respects, and their young faces solemn as they laid strips of bright cloth beside Halona's wrapped form. The girls had been through hell during their captivity, but Clara could see healing beginning in the way they stayed close to each other. Below at the river's edge, Walter Herman was meeting with farmers from 3 different counties, their voices carrying as they drafted a petition for the U.S. Deputy Marshal. Pete McGurk's death had created a power vacuum, and these men were determined to fill it with law rather than letting some new outlaw claim the river rights. Dr. Edwin worked quietly under a canvas shelter, tending to wounds that ranged from bullet grazes to rope burns. His medical bag had been supplemented with supplies brought by arriving settlers, and Clara was grateful to see proper bandages replacing the makeshift materials they'd been forced to use. Quanah sat with his back against a cottonwood, his left arm bound against his chest while his shoulder healed. The injury would leave him weakened for weeks, but he bore it with stoic patience. Ivilo leaned against his good side, finally beginning to lose the haunted look that captivity had put in his young eyes. Clara settled beside them, close enough that her knee brushed Quanah's, but not so close as to jostle his injured shoulder. In her lap, she held the Spencer carbine that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat over the past week. "The marshal will come soon," Quanah said quietly, his English now flowing with confidence. "Edwin's message went out this morning." Clara nodded, understanding the implications. U.S. Deputy Marshal James Crawford was known for his fair dealing and intolerance for corruption. With Dr. Edwin's testimony and evidence from Pete's ledger, justice would finally reach this corner of the frontier. "What will you do?" She asked the question carrying more weight than simple curiosity. Quanah was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on the river. "My people will return to the reservation eventually. The old ways are ending, and fighting them only brings more death." Clara heard the grief in his voice. Not just for Halona, but for a way of life disappearing as surely as morning mist. The great Comanche bands that had once ruled the southern plains were being herded onto ever smaller parcels of land. "That doesn't answer my question," she said softly. Quanah's lips curved in something that might have been a smile. "You ask hard questions, Clara Whitmore." "I learned from a good teacher," she replied, and this time she was rewarded with a real smile that reached his eyes. Ivilo stirred between them, his small hand reaching out to touch Clara's wrist where the rope burns had finally healed to pink scars. "You stay with us?" he asked in careful English, his voice carrying hope of a child who'd lost too much already. Clara's throat tightened as she looked down into his trusting face. How could she explain the complexities of state law racial prejudice and social convention to a 7-year-old boy? "We'll see," she said gently, the same words her father had used when she'd asked for things that seemed impossible. As evening approached and cook fires began to bloom across the camp, Clara found herself helping Mary prepare a meal from their pooled supplies. The school teacher had decided to remain in Willow Springs rather than return to her previous post, and she was already talking about establishing a proper school. "It could work," Mary said quietly as she stirred a pot over the fire. "White and Comanche children learning together, preparing for whatever comes next." Clara glanced across the camp to where Ivilo was teaching two German farm boys how to braid grass into rope. His patient instructions bridging gaps between languages. Maybe Mary was right. Maybe this place could become something new and better than what had come before. It would need strong leadership. Clara replied, watching Quanah discuss water rights with Dr. Edwin, while his questions revealed a mind that grasped legal complexities as quickly as military tactics. People willing to stand up to those who think the old hatreds are the only way. Mary's knowing look suggested she understood exactly who Clara was thinking of. As full darkness settled over the camp, Clara sat with Ivilo tucked against her side, while Quanah adjusted her position with gentle hands, ensuring she was comfortable despite his own injury. It was a domestic scene that would have been impossible a week ago, but felt natural now. When their fingers interlaced as they both reached to tuck the boy's blanket around him, Clara felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the nearby fire. Quanah's touch lingered longer than necessary, his calloused palm gentle against her work-hardened skin. No words passed between them, but Clara found herself memorizing the moment the weight of the sleeping child between them, the soft murmur of the river nearby, the way Quanah's thumb traced a small circle on the back of her hand before he reluctantly pulled away to check the sentries. Tomorrow would bring decisions about land claims and legal proceedings, about whether the fragile alliance they'd built could survive in a world that didn't approve of white women keeping company with Comanche warriors. But for tonight, Clara allowed herself to believe that some things were stronger than convention. 3 weeks later, Clara stood waist-deep in the calm shallows of Willow Springs, the morning sun warm on her shoulders, as she watched the familiar scene play out around her. Quanah stood nearby, his left arm, finally free of its sling, though still stiff from the shoulder injury. Ivilo splashed happily in the shallow water between them, his laughter echoing off canyon walls like music. The image echoed their first meeting in these same waters, 3 people bound together by circumstance and choice, the river flowing around them like a blessing. But everything else had changed. U.S. Deputy Marshal Crawford had arrived with the spring supply train. His weathered face grim as he listened to Dr. Edwin's testimony and examined evidence from Pete's ledger. The marshal's justice was swift and thorough. Lucas's crimes were officially recorded. Pete's stolen deeds were declared invalid, and a new deputy was appointed from among the honest farmers who'd helped in the fight. Clara's inheritance was restored with full water rights, making her one of the more prosperous landowners in the territory. She could have returned east, could have sold the mill, and lived comfortably where her past wouldn't follow her. Instead, she'd chosen to stay. The practical arrangement she'd proposed at the marshal's hearing was working better than anyone had hoped. The Comanche families were allowed to maintain their seasonal camp at Willow Springs in exchange for helping patrol the river against future outlaws. White settlers could use the water during planting and harvest seasons, while the Comanche retained rights during their traditional hunting periods. Dr. Edwin served as mediator for any disputes, his medical practice providing him with natural authority among all parties. Mary had established her school in the old trading post, where children of all backgrounds learned to read and write in both English and Comanche. Miss Clara. Ivilo tugged at her sleeve, his face bright with excitement. Look what I found. He held up a piece of smooth river glass, green as emerald and polished by years of tumbling in the current. Clara examined it solemnly, recognizing the importance of the gift. It's beautiful, she said, slipping the glass into her pocket. I'll keep it safe. The boy beamed and returned to his exploration, leaving Clara alone with Quanah, as sounds of the waking camp drifted across the water. She'd built her new cabin on a bend of the river, equidistant between Willow Springs and the Comanche camp, where she could see both communities from her front porch. The isolation suited her, giving her space to think and work, without constant scrutiny from neighbors who still weren't sure what to make of her choices. But she was never truly alone. Quanah and Avilo visited regularly to help with heavy work and share meals around her hearth. The supply train brought mail. Quanah said quietly, producing a folded paper from his shirt pocket. From state authorities in Austin. Clara's stomach tightened as she recognized official seals. Government correspondence usually meant complications or worse. It was notification of a federal investigation into corruption, prompted by Deputy Marshal Crawford's report on Pete's operations. The investigators wanted Clara's testimony about her father's murder and the broader pattern of land theft. "They want me to travel to Austin," she said after reading the formal language, "to testify before a state grand jury." Quanah's expression didn't change, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes. A trip to the state capitol would mean weeks away from Willow Springs, and there was no guarantee she'd be welcome to return if authorities decided her arrangement with the Comanche was too irregular. "You will go?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "I have to," Clara replied. "Too many people suffered under Pete's system. If my testimony can prevent it from happening again." She didn't finish the thought, but Quanah understood. Justice demanded its due even when the cost was personal sacrifice. As they waded toward shore, Clara noticed Morning Star approaching with something wrapped in soft deerskin. The woman had taken over many of Halona's duties as keeper of tribal memories. For you," Morning Star said in careful English, extending the bundle toward Clara. "Halona wanted you to have this when understanding was complete." Clara unwrapped the deerskin to reveal the beaded amulet she'd glimpsed before, worked in patterns that seemed to flow like water, and beneath it the familiar scrap of mill burlap that connected their stories. "The circle is complete now," Morning Star said gently. "Your father's spirit can rest, knowing his sacrifice bore good fruit. Singing Bird's son has found the family she prayed for, and 2 peoples have learned to share water without blood." Clara looked at Ivilo, playing in the shallows, then at Quanah, standing beside her, with understanding in his dark eyes. Everything that had happened, the rescue, the alliance, the growing love between them, had been built on foundations deeper than either had realized. "So, what happens now?" she asked, gesturing toward the letter from Austin and the amulet that carried the weight of completed destiny. Quanah was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from Clara to Avilo and back again. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of choice freely made. "Now you do what honor demands," he said simply. "You testify in Austin, help the law find justice for all Pete's victims. And when you return—" He paused, and Clara saw something vulnerable in his expression, hope tempered by hard-won wisdom. "When you return," he continued with growing confidence, "your place will be waiting, here where the river runs fair and children of all peoples can grow in safety." Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she understood the full meaning of his words. He was offering her not just a home, but a future one built on mutual respect rather than desperate necessity on love that had grown slowly in the soil of shared trials. "The state authorities might not approve," she said, voicing practical concerns that couldn't be ignored. "Let them disapprove," Quanah replied with quiet confidence. "We have proven that different peoples can live in peace when good faith replaces greed. Let Austin send investigators, they will find a community that works." As the morning sun climbed higher, burning off the last wisps of river mist, Clara made her choice. She would go to Austin and tell her story to whoever would listen. She would help ensure that Pete McGurk's crimes were properly recorded and that future settlers would find law instead of chaos. But she would also return to Willow Springs, to the cabin she'd built, where she could watch both communities flourish, to the school where Mary taught children that understanding was possible between peoples who'd once been enemies. Most importantly, she would return to the quiet evening moments when Quanah's hand found hers in firelight, when Avilo slept peacefully between them, as living proof that love could grow from tragedy's ashes, when the river sang its eternal song of renewal for anyone wise enough to listen. On a cold night 3 months later, as autumn wind rattled cottonwood leaves, Clara tucked Avilo's blanket around his sleeping form and felt Quanah's hand settle over hers with the naturalness of sunrise. Their fingers interlaced, without conscious thought, no longer needing excuses to justify the comfort they found in simple contact. The Austin testimony changed things. Clara said quietly, remembering state officials who'd been surprisingly supportive after hearing the full story. Changed how they see us, maybe. Quanah replied with wisdom born from experience. Did not change what we built here. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to night sounds and the distant murmur of water over stone. Neither felt need for elaborate declarations, as they were frontier people, and their love was expressed in practical language of shared work, mutual protection, and countless small kindnesses that made survival something more than mere existence. Spring floods again next year, Quanah said, eventually echoing words he'd spoken in very different circumstances. People will need someone who can read water. Clara replied, completing the circle of understanding between them. When he leaned over to kiss her forehead, gentle benediction rather than passionate claiming, Clara felt the perfect rightness of the moment settle into her bones. They had built something real here, in the space between cultures, something that would endure long after state authorities stopped paying attention. The river flowed past their joined communities, carrying away the last traces of violence and bringing promise of whatever tomorrow might hold. And in the circle of firelight, with Avilo safe between them and their hands intertwined. Like their destinies, Clara Whitmore and Quanah knew they had found something worth more than gold or government approval. They had found home in each other, family and choice, rather than blood and love, that had grown from tragedy's ashes into something strong enough to bridge any divide that prejudice might try to create between them. In a land where water was precious and justice was rare, they had discovered both in abundance, flowing as free as the river that had brought them together, and would carry their story forward into whatever future they chose to build.